You should have told me.
Since everybody here is in some measure of engine repair, we're basically gonna do this thing right here. We're gonna talk about some pistons and stuff. And I got some stuff to hit you with that you may or may not have seen before. Like, this is somebody washing some pistons. Have you seen this before? That's not a big deal, is it? Okay. So, Rachel loves to do this, you know. I mean, she likes to do these animations and all that. But the pistons are a really hard working thing, and you think, well, I already know all about pistons and all that, and so on and so forth. But you got the compression above the piston on the way up. The spark ignites the air-fuel mixture, and then it's an explosion basically that pushes that thing down, and that's the way they show it in there. But it's a sort of a burn thing. And so what we got to look at here is why don't they fail more? So for the next 45 degrees of crank rotation, the mixture burns. Of course, I feel like it goes out before that, personally, but this, this particular period thing, that article that I was researching was saying that, so I just use that number. But the gas temperature jumps up to 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is when you're above 2,500, you're making NOx, right? So the melting point of pure aluminum is just under 1,200 degrees. So why doesn't it melt the pistons? If it's going up to 4,500 degrees, or even 2,500 degrees, why don't the pistons melt?
Because it's only doing it for just a second.
The coolant cools down
All right.
fast.
Okay. Well, there's really more to it than that. Now, you ever seen one busted like that?
Yeah, that's a motor right now.
Yep. There you go. All right. So how can they survive that? Well, pistons are exposed to combustion only 60 to 80 degrees out of the 720th four-stroke cycle. That's only 10%. Second, the piston surface is protected by a thin boundary layer of stagnant gas. That's called surface quenching. By some of the engineers and all that. That clings to it, and it provides really efficient insulation. So basically, you've got a little bit of insulation there just naturally. And then she got really fancy with this stuff, keeping them cool. All right. Now, high-performance engines and also the Power Stroke diesels, have basically got oil jets under there that keep spraying oil on them all the time. It's just hooked into the oil pressure. It's always spraying oil on them and all that. But anyway, traditional pistons conducted their heat away to the cooler cylinder wall. So the cylinder wall kept the pistons cool, and you notice that coolant flows all around the cylinder walls on these things anyway. However, if it runs too cold, it starts eating away the metal. Now, you know what? Like 90% of engine wear on a cylinder wall is due to sulfuric acid content in the wall. That's why changing the oil regularly makes one last so much longer.
All right, Richard.
Yeah.
Matt ordered some pistons that's like coated in some stuff, and they like 4,500 more degrees than standard than tape.
Yeah, they also put graphite and stuff on the sides of them. You talking about that black stuff on the side of the piston?
No, this one's coated in some stuff a guy especially makes them.
Yeah, that's not surprising. Matt's always doing this. There's those oil jets I was talking about, and that's kind of what it looks like when it's spraying up under that piston. This is the cutaway of the piston, and the oil jet, when you actually see one, looks like that right there. If you look in there, that's to keep the piston cool. All right, so you got some G-forces here that a lot of us don't even think about. Piston speeds about 4,500 feet per minute on the average, but what really limits it is the stress that pistons undergo and abrupt changes of direction. Now, whenever you're in the firing, basically the piston is pushing down on the crank through the connecting rod and the wrist pin. Okay, but whenever it's going down, there's other ones that are going up and being pulled down. Right, so that wrist pin has really got to do a lot of jerking and pulling and all that kind of stuff, and that's what the deal is. A lot of the time we don't even think about that. And also the wrist pin, a lot of times will be all set and the piston will be weighted that way. There's a story I told one time about how, and I may have told it last semester, I can't remember, where I built a Volkswagen Bug engine that was in the back of a rail buggy this friend of mine had. And after we got it all put back together, we were cranking it, I cranked it up and it was knocking. Well, I said, I know I didn't leave anything loose. And so I was down in Texas at the time, I was about 20 years old, and I called my dad, I says, why is this dadgum thing knocking? He says, which way did you point the arrows on top of the head of the pistons? Because ordinarily the arrow or the notch goes on the front of the piston, which is toward where the belts and all are, right? Well, on the Volkswagen Bug, they're supposed to be pointed toward the front of the car, which is toward the flywheel, and I had put them in there backwards, and that was making it knock. Now he did tell me, he says, if you can put up with that knocking racket, it'll outrun the snot out of one that's put together right. But he says, but I don't know if it'd come apart. And I ain't kidding you, when we would take off on that thing with it knocking like that, it jerked the front wheels off around that high taking off. But after we put it together right, it still had plenty of power, but it wouldn't pull the wheels up anymore. It's just a little something there. 7,000 G. You got 15,000 RPM, which is really high. But that's like any motorcycles. That's 7,000 gravities. Now you know, you're talking about when a fighter pilot is flying. A lot of times he'll have to put up with a lot of G forces whenever he's banking in a plane or something like that. That's why they wear G suits. Well, anyway, these Pistons ain't got no G suits, so they have to put up with also. The higher the acceleration, the harder the connecting rod tries to tear the wrist pin out of the piston, and the faster cracks form in the material. Now, whenever we are cleaning the ring grooves in a piston to put the rings back in there, you don't just put rings on a piston, you got to clean it up. And you got these little, you can take a busted piece of a piston ring and scrape that carbon out of the bottom of them grooves, because if you don't do that, it's not going to fit in there right anyway. And I'm going to talk about something else here in a minute.
They make a tool to do it.
They do. They make a tool to do it. But if you're using that tool, you be doggone careful, because if you keep going and you start taking off metal, you'll make that piston weak and you'll jerk the head off of it. I mean, it'll actually pull the head off the piston. I've seen that happen before, because somebody got a little too, oh man, this is pretty, I'm going to make it real shiny, and they keep going and they're curling off aluminum in there. It's pretty dadgum nasty whenever that thing comes apart because you did too much of that. Now, there's this guy that's over at a shop close by over here, at this salvage yard shop, and he was talking about this situation where he just threw rings and bearings in one and put it together and all that, and he cranked it up and it'd run 10 minutes and it would quit. And then he let it cool off. And he'd crank it back up and it'd run 10 minutes and it would quit. Then he let it cool off. I mean, it would basically try to seize up after 10 minutes. So what do you think was wrong with that one?
Didn't have good oil clearance.
No, it had good everything. The oil clearance was beautiful, but all that. But what he failed to do, the one crucial step he failed to do, he didn't check the end gap on the rings. And if you put the piston down in there, the ring down there without the piston, you check the end gap, you ought to have about 1,000 to 1.5 thousandths clearance, on some that are really tight. Well, what he had to do is he had to pull all the pistons back out and pull the rings off and file the rings a little bit on the very end of them to give himself some ring gap, because he didn't check that. Now, I never had that problem when I used to, build engines back in the 70s. We just throw rings and bearings in there and drive the thing off on faith, But he is about my age, and he had done enough of that to where this thing, didn't work out for him. But anyway, when it jerks the wrist pin out, it looks like that. See how that picture looks? It just kind of snatches it apart and all that. But that's where it failed. That particular one failed, was that wrist pin, coming apart like that. All right. Now then, ring tension. The top piston rings on the higher performance engines have got to be plated or filled with a higher melting point material such as chromium, which is 3,405 degrees Fahrenheit, or molybdenum, which is 4,720. That's really, really high temperatures, obviously. And of course, there's the crown of that piston is broke off above that land, and that kind of thing happens sometimes too. A lot of the times when that happens, it'll either happen because something got down in the cylinder, or you got some really, really heavy spark knock going on, pinging or something like that. And I'll tell you something else too. I don't know if you've ever seen them or not, but sometimes piston rings will have the edge that goes against the cylinder wall will be curved instead of flat on some of the real high performance ring, because if the piston tilts a little bit, it holds on to its seal. And so anyway, that's another thing right there. Okay, oil scraper rings. It's basically a squeegee, and she misspells squeegee, but you see what I'm talking about. Squeegee sounds like a fish. But anyway, there's a pair of thin flexible rails. It makes high pressure. That's what they look like down there. The bottom ring, it's got the little separator in between the two little steel ones. And they got a really high specific pressure pressed outward by a backing spring usually. Now, not every time. Some of them just got that's a different style right there than the one up there, but it does the same job. They're all one piece. Now, some of them, like you see right here, you got something similar to that, but there's a spring in there that's basically pushing out real evenly all the time. And then there's one like this one up here, sort of. But you might notice the way that they do that. So we got a few other things here. This is a story I always like to tell, where there was a Mustang Saline that came in over there that Donnie drew the ticket on it, and it was throwing a misfire code for cylinder number 4, I think it was. And so it didn't run bad. He couldn't really tell that there was anything wrong with the way it ran, but if he's looking at the scan tool, it's basically got a 40 RPM, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this power balance test that the IDS does that we got in here. It had a 40 RPM dropout on that cylinder. It's just 40 RPM. And so he would clear the code, and he did things to try to correct it with injectors and whatnot. But he still had that, and he kept throwing the code back. I mean, after they drove it, a little while, it'd come back in there with that same code. And so he checked the compression on it, and the compression was 40 pounds lower on that cylinder than it was the rest of them. So when they pulled the motor apart, the guy barred the engine over and watching the pistons come up, and this one here was about 1/4 of an inch lower when it hit the top dead center than all the rest of them. And when he pulled it apart, he found that bent rod. Now the engine was running just great. You could not tell there was anything wrong with it, but the misfire detection picked it up. So what do you think bent that rod? What would bend a rod like that? What's the only, huh?
Water?
Yeah, he probably drove into the drink and it drank a little bit of water, and it bent it perfectly, and then it spit the water on it. But then after that, he wound up with a misfire. And that's the actual piston that came out of that motor. And anyway, that was an interesting little story. I got some more here too. When a crankshaft breaks, this is what it looked like on the table. Popped in two. That's that little 4.2 little 97 F-150 had a 4.2 in it. First heard from this guy, he actually worked on the other campus, and he says, I was losing oil pressure on my truck, so I took it to a shop somewhere, I don't know where he took it to. And he says, and they put bearings and everything in it, they charged me $1,500. And he says, and about 6,000 or 7,000 miles later, the oil pressure started getting low again, and turning on my light and all. So I went back to that same shop, and they said, we don't want to fool with that truck anymore, get it out of here. So he took it to a different shop, and they charged him $1,700 and claimed that they had put the rod caps on backwards at the first shop. And so 6,000 or 8,000 miles later, he's got low oil pressure again. And so he comes here, and so we tore it down, and we put a crankshaft kit in it, we put cam bearings in it, we put an oil pump in it. Running great, good oil pressure. 4,000 miles later, he says it made a bunch of noise and it quit, and now it won't start, and it just feels terrible. I said, okay, so let's get it in here and see what we got. So we pull the pan off, and when we looked up in there, we saw this. It just popped smooth right there. Now you might notice that the crankshafts, like this one right here, have got these journals for the rods. See, that crank has only got a little bit of metal connecting it between journal and journal. All right. So anyway, that thing had broke. So then I called the parts store, and the parts store where I bought the crankshaft kit says that crankshaft is not guaranteed by the people that sold it. And he said, I didn't know that when I sold it to you, but it's not guaranteed. And I said, well, that's bad. So I said, let's get us another crankshaft over here, whatever happens. Well, I'll pay for the crankshaft and anything else that was damaged by this. Well, they messed up 2 pistons. So we got it all took apart. Everything was wonderful, right? So we got the crankshaft kit, we put the bearings in there, we put the crank in there, and when we torqued it down, it locked up. Wouldn't turn. All right, so I said, well, that's not good. So I took the straight edge like you're supposed to do, and I put it down in there. When you couldn't tell there was anything wrong with that block, but I had to take it over to the machine shop in Dothan and get it line bored so that it would work. And after we line bored it, we put the crankshaft in there, and you could just slap it and spin it. It was so smooth. But what happened was when that crankshaft broke, it distorted that engine block, and it had to be line bored. But you couldn't look at it or even measure it with anything we had to measure it with until there was anything wrong with it. And after they line boarded it, it was perfect. And he still got that truck. And that's been like 5, 6, 7 years ago. He's still driving it. Never had any more oil pressure problems or anything else. We put an additional set of cam bearings in. Anyway, that's the thing. That's the little deal right there. Now this right here is a service bay thing. Some of you guys might have heard me tell this story briefly. The Mercury Sable was pulled in over there, and I told this goofy boy that was in here, I said, bring it up to 1500. Let's watch the oxygen sensor switch, because we were doing engine performance. It was a semester, kind of like some of you guys are in now. And he decided he would go all the way to the floor and then come back to 1500, and the gas pedal stuck under the floor mat. And it was an old engine anyway, and he threw 2 rods out of it. It sounded like a bomb going off right there. Boom! And one guy that had been in Desert Storm, that was 50-something years old. I thought he was going to jump over a bench, because he still had a little PTSD. But anyway, that's what the oil pan looked like when we pulled it off. It just came all to pieces. Busted, the wrist pin's still attached and all that. There was another one, and this one boy that was in here, he came in with his little 2006 Ford Ranger with crap like this in the pan. It had come all to pieces. And I said, what's up with this? And he says, I don't know, you know, what happened, all that kind of stuff. And his mother called me and she says, will we be able to tell if he was coon dogging that truck when you pull it apart? And I said, yeah, we'll know. And he went, no. So, well, what happened was he had took a bottle of nitrous and a piece of a water hose and just run it into the intake. This sounds like a Jonathan Price story, right? So anyway, so whenever he would be out there and he was drag racing on that thing over here in Andalusia, and whenever he would take off on it, he would crack that doggone, it was a truck like your brother had got, that one of them kind of trucks. And he'd crack some of that nitrous in there through that dadgum water hose. And he says he raced that thing about all night long before it ever come apart. He was real surprised how well it held together. But anyway, it was 2006 Ford Ranger. But anyway, that's a crazy story. And he was a nut anyway. All right, now what is this right here? What do you see? What do you see there? I see timing chains.
Rags.
Yep. Right there, little rags in them holes. And that's whenever we got this valve cover off and working on putting these timing chains. They used to have us put these cartridges in there under warranty. And there was also, there's a tensioner that goes against that one. It comes as an oil tensioner. And they would have us, there was a little, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. It's going to be there a little while. That's on a Ford Explorer single overhead cam. And they had us put a volume reduction plug in there because the timing chain would rattle when you first started it up. Now that right there is a burned out bearing. I think that was from that Sable that, you know, came apart of where it just beaded all the daylights out of it. This right here is signs of coolant migration. You probably heard me talk about this before. There's a whole bunch of ways that a head gasket can blow. And a lot of times somebody will come and say, got to blow the head gasket. You know, that's the first thing they got out of their mind when they ain't even tested nothing. Now a lot of the times if you see it, you know, punching steam and, you know, making that stinky sweet smell coming out of the radiator, you know you got a blown head gasket. But Alan Cobb called me one day about his little Toyota, his little 93 Toyota Camry he was driving. I drove over there to Perry's store to get him because he said it was running hot and it had split the radiator. And so I drove over right quick. It didn't take about 10 minutes to get there, and I poured water in there and we cranked it up. And right away it started pushing, you know, punching coolant out like you do, you know. And I said, well, Cobb, you've blown a head gasket, you know, because it got real hot. And he said, well, we got to do what we got to do. And I said, okay, well, take it back to the shop. So they hauled it back over here, you know. And so whenever I pulled it in the shop, I'm going to show everybody, this is what a blown head gasket is like if it's pushing combustion into the water. I'll say, so I get it in here and I crank it up, we fill it up, and it never done any more of that. I never would have believed it. I'd have sworn on a court of law out there at Perry's store that it had a blown head gasket. But after I got it in here, I couldn't duplicate that anymore. I don't know if it changed the shape of the head, then it went back where it was or whatever. But anyway, I put and before it damaged the gasket, but we put the radiator in. He drove that thing for another, you know, 10,000 miles before he traded it in. Anyway, this one here, the way this plays out is when coolant migrates from the coolant passage into here, a lot of the times it'll just ease that coolant in there when you've parked the car. And it'll wet the spark plug, and you'll crank it up, and it'll be going bup, 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 it'll be skipping. And then it'll clean up its act, and you won't have any more trouble with it until the next time you drive. My Jeep used to do that. I'd drive it from here, park at Winn-Dixie to go in and get bananas or something, come back out, crank it up, it's skipping on number 3, just like this. And I got a flashing check engine light, and then it cleans up its act, and it don't do it no more until the next time in the summer I'm driving from here over to Winn-Dixie, Winn-Dixie is closing up now, so I won't have to stop there anymore. But the long and the short of it is, we've got a situation on this one. How do you find that? How do you find out what's going on? Because it can be more than one thing causing this. What I do, and listen to this really careful because it's important, I crank it up, while it's skipping, I shut it off. I pull all the plugs out. And if I see one steaming, I know I got water getting in there, right? That ain't complicated. If I see that it's stinking wet with gas, I'm looking for a dripping injector. Got me? Shut it off while it's still skipping. Don't let it clean up its act, right? And you'll find it that way. If you see little dry, crusty green stuff on one that you're pulling out, a lot of times that means that you got antifreeze weeping into that cylinder. And you'll see that right here. This is what it looked like when you get I actually showed a picture of this last semester, I think, in a war story. But that right there is a dye test that we did when that one shop down in Florida somewhere said it needed a rear main seal. And the cylinder, this was on a 98 Dodge Stratus with a 2.4. And it was leaking from right here. Now, here's something else. On these overhead cam engines, there is a pressurized oil passage that has to go through the, you know, head gasket up there to all the camshafts. And if that thing fails right there, that's where it leaked. That dye picture I just showed you was this same vehicle. And it was leaking oil right there, really, really bad. So we had to put a head gasket on that one. All right, now this right here is really important, being able to find top dead center on a Jeep straight six. What's the firing order on a straight six? Somebody give me, what is it? Anybody remember?
And then in a straight line.
Yeah, straight six. No, it's 153624.
What was it?
153624. Okay, so the companion cylinders are going to be, what's the companion cylinder for one if the firing order is 153624? Go the way one on, if it was on the opposite side of the distributor cap, if it had a distributor in it, what would that be? 15, it'd be 6, wouldn't it? Good answer. Okay, so when you get this mark lined up on a straight 6, or on any other engine, even on this one right here, that's the V6, the companion cylinder and the number 1 cylinder are both going to be on top dead center. You do not have top dead center marks for the others, do you? What if you need to find top dead center on cylinder number 3?
You pull the spark plug out and stick some in it and turn it until it comes up, and then turn it back until it starts going down.
There is a, yeah, well, sort of, there is a tool I got in here where you can find that, but why don't we just go ahead and turn this, you know, of course it's really difficult to do if you haven't got it marked, but if you know where 120 degrees is, you know, like 3 parts of it, like a pie cut in 3 equal parts, then basically 153, see, you turn it 120 degrees, you turn it another 120 degrees, and you stop it exactly on that, you know, you're going to have to make those marks, but you can do that without doing anything except just turning it in the direction the engine turns. It's pretty important. That's on a V6. Now on a 4-cylinder, you turn it to 180, and that's pretty darn easy to do, right? And on a V8, you turn it 45 degrees, which is what? No, 90 degrees, I'm sorry, not 45. You turn it 90 degrees on a V8. And the way that you tell how many firing events and how many top dead center events there are in any engine is you divide the number of cylinders into 720, because the crank got to turn twice to be a full cycle. So if you 6 into 720 is 120, right? Everybody knows that, right? Okay. Okay, now this is why it's important to double check your gaskets. This guy, first semester I taught here, he had this Pontiac or Oldsmobile or something, I think it's Oldsmobile Cutlass, and he pulled a timing cover off and he put this timing cover gasket on it. You see the problem here? See that? He had the wrong gasket. That gasket was supposed to come out here like this, and he didn't even check his gaskets, but it looks like everywhere else it lines up real good, don't it? But if you lay them gaskets side by side, and you know what he had here? He had a monster oil leak. I mean, it was pumping oil out there like he was flushing it out of a hose. It was really bad. And he had to pull all that back off and put the right gasket on it. He had a gasket that was cut different than the one he needed. And in spite of the fact that it looked perfect everywhere else. Now there's one guy over here that pulled heads off an engine, and he's a guy that lives over in Elba, and he said he's gonna put head gaskets on it. He's ready to put them on. He said, I don't like these head gaskets. I said, well, tell me what the problem is. And you might notice that where these water passages are, see the little bitty holes where the water passages are? That's so the water will go through there slow and absorb more heat. Those gaskets were Felpro gaskets, but they were cut wrong so that the water passages were just as big as the holes in the block in the head. And that'll burn up an engine. And so he laid them things on the bench and he looked at them, you know, and he says, this doesn't look right. And so I called the parts guy, and he called Felpro, and they said, oh no, get those back to us, because see, this would be an engine destroying thing. It would have been the gasket's fault, and they'd have had to buy an engine. But so always compare your gaskets and make sure that they're as close as they can be, you know. All right, now this one right here is another story. This keyway, you see where the keyway is? You see where the key is? The symptom was low engine vacuum black smoke on one like the Bronco out there. All right, so, and it had fuel injection, all that kind of stuff. He's thinking about something like that. Well, he puts the vacuum gauge on it, and he's got like, 10 or 12 inches of vacuum idling. And he says, I'm not sure what to do with this dadgum thing, because I've got low engine vacuum. I said, well, what causes low engine vacuum? EGR flow, late ignition timing, late valve timing. Those are the 3 primary things. If you got a great big vacuum leak right next to where you're measuring it, you may see it that way. But the long and short of it is, I said, if you know the timing's right, and you know the balancer hadn't slipped, to make you think your timing's right, that you need to look a little deeper. And what he turned out to find was that somebody had pulled that balancer off and put it back on there and didn't tighten it enough. Because they didn't tighten it enough, all the pressure that was pulling that camshaft was riding on that pulley, see, because you're supposed to pinch with that balancer, you're supposed to pinch that gear between the boss on the crankshaft and the balancer. And what happened, since it wasn't pinched, this right here sheared off. And it wound up with late vacuum because the crankshaft was running ahead of the camshaft. Because the keyway had slipped and the gear was, what was basically pulling it. That's another story there. All right, now, Lauren, what's wrong with this picture right here?
So you get a gasket loose.
The guy, the boy told me, he says, I'm all done. And I said, well, you did that quick. And then we poured the coolant in, it's running out all over the floor. And I got there and took a picture of it, and he just sort of slopped it over. I don't know what he was thinking about or why he didn't tighten the bolts, but that's shoddy work. Okay, maybe hard to see, but what's wrong with that picture?
Start.
That bolt's loose. Somebody figured it wouldn't matter, and they left that bolt loose. That stinks. Don't like that. What's wrong with that picture? The stupid hose clamps around the radiator neck, and the hose is just stuck on there with nothing clamping it. The car came in here like that. It wasn't a student that did that, okay? Okay, now this right here is the importance of plastic gauge. You take that little waxy string, you put it on there, you torque it, you pull it back off, and you see how much space there is right there, and that tells you how much oil clearance you got. And this right here is as much as you're supposed to have, 1.5 thousandths. If you've got more than that, you're going to probably have main bearing noise. This is the volume reduction plug I was talking about. Whenever you pull that little, whenever we had a recall on a recall program, and we would pull that little oil plug out right there, and we'd stick that way down in there. Believe it or not, it would fit all down in there, and then we put that back in, and that would keep it from causing timing chain rattle. Identify this component.
It's a turbo,
It is a turbo, but what kind?
diesel truck.
Yep, variable geometry turbocharger. Cutaway model. All right. Okay. Now, somebody can obviously tell me something they know that they didn't know when they came in here, right?
That the gasket hole needs to be smaller than the slot hole.
Mm-hmm. They do. I mean, they will be. If you look at head gaskets, you'll see that every time. And they don't ever have it full size. You seem like it'll be a lot of water going through there, but if it runs through there too quick, it'll overheat. And keep that in mind. All right, let's knock off.